Welcome, everyone. I have welcome John Crain. He's CTO of ICANN. Looks fantastic session on security, and I'll turn it over to John, and I'll mute my mic and video.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, afternoon, evening, middle of the night, whatever time it is, wherever you are. My name is John Crain. As Glenn said, I am with the organization called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, better known as ICANN. Been there a little over 20 years in various roles. Currently, I am the Chief Security Officer and or the SSR officer, as we call it, and the interim CTO, as my boss decided to move on to, I don't know if it's greener pastures, but other pastures last week. So I have two jobs at the moment just to keep me busy. So I was asked to come and talk about security. Because it's ICANN, I'm going to talk about identifier security. And I'm probably going to focus mostly, well, I'm definitely going to focus mostly on domain names or the domain name system. I'm going to run you through a little bit why, and then I'm going to talk about two elements of security related to the DNS and the identifiers. One is about protecting that system, and the other is about people who abuse the system. And really what I'm going to talk about is what ICANN is doing in this area. So my title, the other one, because I have two at the moment, is the Chief SSR Officer, pronounced Cicero. Why SSR? Because, well, security is not just about keeping things secure. It's also important that things remain stable and that when everything goes wrong, that things can bounce back, that they can be resilient. We use three very specific versions of definitions of these. So security being the capacity to protect internet identifier systems and prevent their misuse. Stability, to make sure that they keep operating as expected so that the users can keep using them. You expect when you log into the internet in the morning, you turn on your laptop and you type in whatever your favorite web page is into your browser, you expect it to go to the same place all the time and to always work. We all know that's not always the case because we do always see issues with particular websites and stuff, but stability. And then resiliency, when that goes wrong, can it bounce back quickly and bounce back correctly? All three of these concepts are important. And it's not good enough just to be secure. It's not good enough just to be stable. And it's not good enough to be both of those if you're not resilient, because you will at some point have a security issue and you need to bounce back from it. So I was asked to focus on security. I will do that. You will see occasionally things come up. Well, that's stability, that's resilience, but we're focusing on security because that's what I was asked to talk about today. So for our particular definition of this, for ICANNs, we're talking about the capacity to protect those internet identifiers. And as I said earlier, I'll focus mostly on the DNS, or the domain name system. If I use an acronym, which I may, because ICANN itself is an acronym and we live in what we call an acronym soup, feel free to ask me. I try not to do it. I try to always spell them out, and I regularly forget because in this technical side of the internet, we use acronyms all the time. So let's talk a little bit about what ICANN's doing with protecting the DNS. I'm going to talk about one major effort that we have undergoing at this moment. ICANN's CEO has the ability to form what we call technical study groups, which is a group of experts from industry and around that can then give him, thank you, Glenn, for posting the terms, that can then give him advice about any particular subject. The most recent one, and this is only the second one we've done, is called the Domain Name System Security Facilitation Initiative. So ICANN works off of strategic plans and operating plans, just like any other business. And as part of the recent strategic plan, there is a paragraph or a whole section in there that basically comes down to ICANN being committed to working with the community to increase the security and stability of the identifier systems. So what happened is our CEO came to me and he said, how are we going to get this input? We had a long discussion. We formed a internal and a board advisory committee, and we decided we'd go the technical study group route. So the idea is to provide the expertise and the guidance to ICANN CEO, and then up from there to the ICANN org and community about different things that ICANN could possibly do to help facilitate security. So that could be pretty much anything. It was fairly open, but we thought it would mainly be about establishing and promoting best practices, facilitating communication in the ecosystem, and facilitating processes that can help stakeholders handle threats. It's important to realize, and people who don't know the ecosystem often forget this, ICANN isn't an organization that runs the internet. It's not what we do. We are a facilitating body, a secretariat, if you like, that has a strong technical side, but we also are heavily focused on policy. The technical study groups tend to focus on the technical side. So one of the things that this group will not do is it will not provide policy recommendations, and it certainly cannot make policy. So let's talk a little bit about the actual technical study group. So this came about after a series of attacks, and attacks have always happened, right? The internet's a networking system. It's always under various attacks in various parts, but there were a few of them that were particularly alarming in recent years. Sea Turtle and DNS espionage, or DNS espionage, and were two that happened sort of around the same time, and showed some very sophisticated attacks against DNS infrastructure, against top-level domain registries, not with the purpose per se of attacking and getting information out of those registries, but really looking at the systems underneath there. So a lot of them were country codes, and it appeared that the attackers, the perpetrators, were really looking for information from people underneath, like the governments, etc., underneath those top-level domains. It's important to remember when you're at the top of the TLD tree, or as you get closer to the top of it, to the root, as we call it, you have more and more systems underneath you. So the effect doesn't just affect one player, it affects everybody within the system. So this study group is looking at things that can best help protect that ecosystem. And one of the things that we realized, and we've talked about this over the past years as well, we really need a new level of collaboration. Because it's not one network or one group or one company that gets affected, it's important that we're able to collaborate when these things happen and that we're able to share information. So who's on the technical study group? So we have a coordinator. The person sort of almost like a chair, but not really a chair because it's not a committee. So is a lady called Medika Kale. She's US of Estonian background, very familiar amongst the security community, and also at this point, the liaison to the Security Stability Advisory Committee, to ICANN's board. I see Steve Crocker is on the call. He held that position at one time as well. A gentleman called Tim April with Akamai Technologies. You may have heard of them. They're in the background moving a lot of traffic around. Yavin Brown, who is from a DNS registry. John Crain, that's obviously me. A gentleman called Rod Rasmussen, who is currently the chair of the SAC, or the Security Stability Advisory Committee, but also the reason he was brought here is not because of his role, just like with many of these people, but because of his expertise. He has ran small security companies and worked a lot in the security field for many years. Mark Rogers is with a company called Octo. Mark is a long-time security person, been in this industry decades. Great hacker, great guy. Katrina Sataki, she is from a country code top-level domain, also works closely with the Latvian CERT. She's at NIC Latvia. Robert Chiska is heavily involved in something called FIRST, which is the incident response teams. It is a large international organization. He's also at CERT AT, Austria. Many years in the CERT industry. And Dwayne Wessels, who is has the title of Distinguished Engineer at a company called VeriSign. VeriSign is a large PLD operator. They operate .com, and Dwayne is well known to us in the DNS operations community for the work he's done at the DNS OARC, Operations Analytics and Research Center, and also many of the other work he's done at the IETF and places like this. So these are well-known characters either in the DNS world or the security world, and sometimes both. So these are the members of the committee. There's also a lot of ICANN staff support behind this. We have 4 or 5 staff members working diligently to help them produce a report. And that's the idea, is that at the end of this, and the end of this could be coincidentally today, I believe we're going to send a advice to Joran Marby, who is the CEO of ICANN, and saying ICANN should think about doing these things. And there's about a dozen recommendations in there, a little bit less. And I want to talk a little bit, because we're going to talk about security, about how we got there. So the first thing we did as a study group is we sat down, and by the way, we've been working on this for, I've personally been working on this for almost 2 years, and the study group has been working on it for about a year, possibly a little bit longer. So it's not a short endeavor. And of course, we've been doing this all remotely. Normally for these kind of things, everybody would get into rooms and use whiteboards, which engineers love. But we didn't really have that possibility. So we did everything remotely. Most of us have not met each other in almost 2 years. Some of the committee members or the steering group members have never actually met at all. So that was very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the first thing we looked at. So we went and we looked at things like Sea Turtle and a plethora of attacks that we were all aware of. And we noted how those attacks took place. We looked at the threat surface that was used. We looked at the threat vectors that were actually leveraged. And then we sort of sat back and said, well, you know, are there known solutions? If so, why weren't they used? If not, is there something we can do there? So let's talk a little bit about the threat vectors that we talked about. There was a long list of attack vectors. The DNS is a protocol that runs on network infrastructure. So it suffers from many of the same attack vectors that everything else on the internet needs to worry about. Things like insecure third-party networks, your supply chain, fate sharing, credential compromise. All systems on the internet have credentials, and if you don't manage them correctly, there is a chance they will get compromised. We also have, of course, the registry systems that also have credentials. There's credentials everywhere. So you'll see when we come back to some of the areas we focused on, that credential management is actually key to security. And then there were some DNS specific things, people impersonating name servers, be those authoritative or recursive, impersonating infrastructure with lookalike domains. A domain name that, when you look at it, may look very similar to a well-known one, either because it's just one character different, or maybe it's using a internationalized character in place from an ASCII character. And to the human eye, most of us look at it and see the same thing. Exploitation of known vulnerabilities. You know, security people will tell you patch, 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 and yet people still don't. And even if you do, can you patch a system and repair a system before the exploit takes place? You know, 0 days, etc., are of course a problem. It's hard to patch if there's not a patch available. We talked a little bit about things that don't as often get talked about. Using the DNS itself as a covert channel. What that means basically is putting data into the DNS to exfiltrate it out of a network. So data exfiltration, but also using it to control systems. Botnets often use the DNS, the domain name system, to actually send signals and controls to the large scale network that they have of exploited machines. And things that have been talked about a long while, DNS cache poisoning, obviously denial of service. I think everybody's familiar with that. Certificate issues with time to lives in the DNS. That's the time that the domain name system remembers a piece of information in your local cache, your resolver. And standard security things like poor implementation choices. The weakest link is always the human, and the decisions that humans make about how they deploy their systems often can cause issues. Protocol weaknesses, takeovers, route hijacking. There was a plethora of things that we talked about. So we boiled it down to 7 basic areas. Identity and access management, access control and authorization issues, resource impersonation, code and protocol vulnerabilities, infrastructure choices, DNS itself as an attack vector, and then denial of service. So really the only one there that is really DNS specific is DNS as the attack vector. But of course you can use other protocols as attack vectors too. So as you're seeing, we're really talking generic security issues here. So as I said, how did we choose these? So we focused on incidents. We couldn't put all of this into the supporting documentation of the recommendations, but wherever we could, we put in recommendations with sources, so you can go and see what happened in those attacks, or you can go and see how the mitigation took place. Unfortunately, that wasn't always possible because obviously some of these are what we call TLP red, traffic light protocol red, some of them TLP orange, which means that we couldn't readily share them with the open community. But we did look at real world incidents, real world attacks, and we tried to focus on what was practical. What could we tell ICANN that would be practical information that they can then pass on to third parties, or they can use to implement better ideas? So I'm going to go briefly through these 7 areas. And if you're interested in getting deeper into them, like I said, the report will hopefully come out today or tomorrow. So credential management and access management is critical to any system. It's not unique to the DNS. It's everywhere. So even though here we say it's unique, it's critical to every point of the DNS system, it's critical everywhere. But if you look at the DNS, you know, the registry staff have credentials, the registrars have credentials, the registrant, the owner of the domain name, has credentials. The operator of the name servers on the hosting provider will have credentials, etc., etc. So wherever there's credentials, you can abuse them. So we focused on registrant credential compromise. Those who've worked in the DNS industry for a while will know that regularly registrants either lose their credentials or have them hacked or have them guessed. And that means you can take away their domain name. If you can get into the registrar and you have the credentials, you can change the name servers, you can initiate transfers, there's all kinds of things you can do. Now, obviously, if you go up the chain and you can get credentials from a registry, a registrar, or a reseller, then the impact is broader. So credentials are everywhere. If you don't manage them correctly, you have big problems. I don't think that is a surprise to anybody. Many of the attacks we saw used various levels of credential compromise. Not a shock. Lack of access control. So even if you have credentials or you appear credentialed to get into a system, if the access controls are not put in place correctly, then maybe you can pivot out of a system and go somewhere you can't. We saw an attack, and I'm not going to say which one because I don't think this is public information, but we saw a large attack that affected the DNS, but the actual attack vector, the surface they went into, was a content management system. And then they were able to pivot from that content management system into other parts of the network ecosystem and get onto the DNS infrastructure. So they had credentials, and the credentials they had looked fairly legitimate because they were the correct credentials for one system. But due to inadequate access control, they were able to pivot over to another system. And although the one system they got into was not considered critical, the ability to go from non-critical to critical infrastructure caused all kinds of fun. So resource impersonation really focuses on being able to pretend to be a piece of the infrastructure you're not. If you can get close to a network and you know what their recursive server is, you can become their recursive server. Think about sitting in a coffee shop and you connect to the network and somebody there has stood up, sitting next to you and has stood up what you think is your recursive server. So you're sitting there thinking you are asking questions of your corporate network because maybe you don't have adequate VPN processes, etc. And instead somebody else is being that recursive resolver. That means they can lie to you. You think you're going to one website and they can send you somewhere completely different. The same could happen with authoritative name servers. The name server for the organization. They could pretend to be that organization's name server and give you, once again, false information. The lookalike domain names, pretending to be a website you're not. It's another form of impersonation. And then, of course, fraudulent certificates. There's been many cases where people have managed to register certificates for domain names that they don't own. That's not a good situation because then you get the nice little padlock on your browser that says, yes, this is a legitimate secure site because it has this SSL certificate, but that certificate actually means nothing because the bad guy managed to get it. And one we don't talk about much in DNS, but route manipulation, BGP hijacking, where instead of you going to, you get the correct IP address, but you're not going to the correct server because somebody has announced the prefix or the route information. And I'm happy to answer questions on this stuff as we get to the end. Code and protocol vulnerabilities, weaknesses in the protocol. Dan Kaminsky, who we recently lost, is famous for the Kaminsky attacks, which was a protocol weakness that he found. These can be exploited. Cache poisoning, we don't hear as much about these days, but this is where you answer into somebody's cache, their DNS cache, and put a bad response in there so that the next person that comes along and says, tell me about that same website, they get the wrong IP address record back, and then they go off to another system, which is not the good guy, but the bad guy. And as I said, these are all things that we've seen in real live attacks. Infrastructure choices. Making choices about where you put your equipment, but also how you set it up, can cause really interesting problems. The TTL is an interesting one. It is the time to live, or the amount of time somebody is supposed to remember an answer from the DNS. If it's really long, that means it takes a long time to change. So sometimes the bad guys will put in long TTLs so that their bad information hangs around a long time. Sometimes they put in really short TTLs, which allows them to move their infrastructure around. So there are different things you can do by picking the time to live of your responses. Just poor implementation choices and fate sharing. Those things often go hand in hand. A poor implementation choice. Oh, see, I was not going to mention Facebook, but somebody brought it up. One could argue that that was a poor implementation choice on their part, either in their code or in the way they had their system. One should not point fingers at these people, because if you're an engineer, you know this kind of thing can happen to anybody. Not quite a spectacular outcome as that one, but that was what we would describe as a interesting or a poor implementation choice. It seems that they had a lot of things there that were also fate sharing. So it wasn't just one of their names that went down, but many. Now, we've seen this in previous issues. Now, of course, that was not an attack, right? These same kind of problems, if people find out about them, can become vulnerabilities and can be used in attacks. That was a misconfiguration issue, they've told us. Was a bad day for them. DNS as the attack vector itself, there are two elements of this. And I can come back to the Facebook book later if you want to. I saw somebody asking questions about there. There's the idea that you can put information into DNS, you can use it for exfiltrate data. And I've been talking about this for probably close on 20 years, but we've seen this in the live. We've seen cases where things like credit card data have been exfiltrated from a system using the DNS. There is a case that I think we document. It is documented, so it should be in the report somewhere, of a system or a attack where they compromise point of sales instances. Those machines that you see on the cashier, on the counter as you come out of a shop. And what they did is they installed a name server on that system. Name servers are very small pieces of code. And then every time somebody ran a card, the name server sent a response to the bad guys. Right? It didn't get a DNS query. They could send in DNS queries if they wanted, but they would send responses. And in those responses were the credit card numbers of all those users and any credential information they wanted. So, it's a real thing. It's happening out there in the real world. And of course, denial of service doesn't go away. Denial of service against DNS itself, but we see denial of service against all kinds of systems. The denial of service against DNS ecosystems is almost constant, and it's not always deliberate. It can be caused by misconfigurations, but it can also be used as a deliberate tool to take down systems. DDoS attacks today can run into the hundreds of gigabytes or even terabytes of data per second. If you have a normal regular network with, say, a 100 gigabyte link or a couple of 100 gigabyte links, it's quite possible for a DDoS to flood that these days. And those can be launched against elements of the ecosystem. We've seen them against registries, we've seen them against specific TLDs, we've seen them against registrars, and we see them on a regular basis against the root servers. Now, the ones against the root servers, luckily, are mostly misconfigurations, but we have seen people testing systems against it. One of the things mentioned in the report was that a group called Anonymous many years ago actually threatened to have an operation to take down the root servers. It did not come to pass, but we had a really interesting weekend waiting for it. In one of my many previous roles, I've ran a few root servers here and there. So, denial of service is a major problem. So as I said, I'm not going to talk about the recommendations because those will be available very shortly, hopefully today or tomorrow, if certainly this week. We use those attack vectors. We looked at what could have been done to mitigate it or to prevent it. We looked at where there were what we consider to be large gaps in the solution space, and we've written a recommendation that will go to the ICANN CEO, Joran Marby. I'm in an interesting situation because I'm on the study group and I'm a staff member. So interestingly enough, I suspect that many of these recommendations may actually come back to haunt me and fall on my plate as to actually try and see if we can implement some of them. So there's a website for that particular element. You can read all about the DSFI, the DNS Security Facilitation Initiative, on ICANN's website. And as I said, expect the report to come out either today or sometime this week. And there will also be a session where many of the study group members will be on a panel this week in ICANN. I should go look that up on the calendar and post that in the chat if I can find it. So that's what ICANN is doing in the area of protecting. There's lots of other small things we're doing, and many of the things that the recommendations will hold are things that ICANN has been working on, but there will also be some new things in there, and I'm hoping the recommendation will allow us to focus where we do our security work. So that's about protecting the system. But what about the other side of it? Misuse of the system. So if everything runs on the DNS or everything needs the DNS to be able to get to somewhere, obviously the bad guys make use of this. So at ICANN, we have three main areas of focus. We try to be recognized as a trusted source for information around DNS abuse. We call this DNS abuse, by the way. We try and provide tools. And then because the generic TLDs are under contract with ICANN, the .coms, the .nets, the .infos, etc., we try and use the contracts to enforce remediation and whatever anti-abuse provisions are in those contracts. Many people would like to see more provisions in those contracts. Some people would like to see less, but whatever's in there, we can enforce. And I see Malud did a reference to manners, which is interesting. I'll come to something that is based on manners a bit later. So we use two terms almost interchangeably, but they do have a slight difference to us. DNS security threats and DNS abuse. There really is no consensus definition of what is DNS abuse. There are multiple definitions, but there is no singular definition. We have a definition that we use because it's in contracts and it's been talked about a lot, plus the community, at least the contracted parties house, which is the registries and the registrars of ICANN, seem to agree on this. So DNS abuse is this broad umbrella, and I think depending on who you ask, they will have a different definition of what falls within the remit of DNS abuse. ICANN has a very specific bylaw section that says that we cannot deal with issues related to content. So there are things that may be DNS abuse in that context that we don't really touch on. We focus on the smaller subgroup that we call DNS security threats. That is really phishing, and where domain names are used for phishing, of course, malware, botnets, farming, and spam, where it's a vector for those prior 4 threat vectors or those attack types. And as I said, not that is what we use. There are many people who will tell you different things should be in there, should not be in there. That is an ongoing discussion that has been ongoing for many years. It's a very important topic. I believe you had or will have Graham Booton from the DNS Abuse Institute talking to you. That's a whole group that just deals with DNS abuse, the wider term, not necessarily just the shorter term. So what do we do? So let's talk about what the goal is. The basic goal is always to make the internet safer for end users. ICANN's focus is identifiers, and in this case, we're talking about the domain name system. So we focus on security threats across the internet that use the DNS. We want to have a collaborative platform inside the organization. So we set up a program inside the organization to deal with this, so that all the parts of our organization, and there are many different parts, we're about 500 plus staff, can actually come together and make sure we're all working together. So this is one of the things we built internally over the last years. And we spend time doing things like this to sort of raise awareness of some of these threats are out there. And one of the most important things for us is that we want people to see ICANN as a neutral, trustworthy place. And we try to base everything on facts and data. You will see a lot of discussions around there, around the ecosystem, and you'll see a lot of people talking about things, and you just need to ask them for the facts. This is something we're seeing a lot in the real world as well today, right? Off the internet. It's like you always need to ask for the data and see the facts about things. So when we make statements about the amount of abuse we're seeing or not seeing, we always try and back it up with data. And in the end, the goal is to try and reduce the rate of those security threats, right? Because you want to protect the end user in the end. So within our group, we have projects, initiative, operations. This is really internal stuff. And it's basically saying we're trying to bring all our parts of our organization together to have one cohesive look at this problem. And there's a steering committee. I sit on the steering committee along with a bunch of other people. So here's some of the tools we have. You may have heard of the domain abuse activity reporting tool. It's basically a system where we take what we call reputation data or reputation feeds, and we look at those names in those feeds, and we look at the names that are resolving on the internet. We focus mainly on generic TLDs, and then we basically publish the statistics. So we've been doing this for about 2-3 years now, and every month we will produce a report, and you can see how the 4 different abuse types that I talked about earlier move up and down as it increases or decreases. And look at a little bit, it's how that's changing and where in the ecosystem it's changing. And we now also have started allowing CCTLDs, country code top level domains, to participate. 17 have joined. We have more coming online. And for them and for the other registries, we give them daily data. So we publish monthly data publicly, but if you're a registry, then for your TLD, you can actually get data every day. And specifically for the country codes, every month we generate a country code specific report that we send to them with some analysis by our researchers so that they can look at that and get an understanding of what's happening in their namespace. We're currently looking at adding registrars to this. Oddly enough, the only place you can identify which registrar a name is associated with publicly, and one of the important things about DAR is we try and use as much as possible public data sources. The only place you can find the registrar data is actually in the WHOIS or RDAP. So we're now working to, ICANN has that data in bulk on a regular basis, not the PII, but the public data. And we're trying to arrange that we can get access to that for research purposes to allow us to measure registrars, which will then allow us to be more granular about where the problem spaces are. So lots of slides in the reports, and I'd suggest you go read the reports. But this is the kind of data we can get. This is not particularly granular. We can go very granular, but this is, the number of domains in GTLD zones, generic TLDs, is slowly going up. The number of names reported as security threats, so the reputation, is actually going down. So in general, that's a good thing. Now, I must put a caveat around that because it goes up, it goes down, it changes. And it depends how you look at the data. So if you were to go and pull just one specific security threat, it may be going down at less of an angle than others. I think you've already had a session about things happening during COVID. COVID's been really interesting because it allowed us at ICANN to do something new, something we'd been wanting to do for a while. So even from bad things, good comes. So what we've been doing is we've been looking at data around names that appear to be associated with the pandemic. We look at all the names that resolve in the generic space and the CCs that we have. And then we filter those names based on strings that appear to be associated with the pandemic in some ways. So obviously things like COVID, pandemic, the various medications, but we also do translations into other character sets and other languages. We also do the lookalike names, etc., etc. That gives us hundreds of thousands of names that have been registered and are resolving with these kind of strings. And then what we do is we go and look for evidence. We go and actually see, can we find concrete evidence that these are being abused or have been abused? And if there is, we send that on to the registrar, and the registrar pretty much every single time takes down the domain. So this is ICANN acting as a abuse reporter or a threat reporter, where we go and we gather the evidence and we pass that on to the registries or the registrars, and they can then take action against those. ICANN had never really done that at any scale before. This is very much focused on the pandemic, but we've published what we've done so other people could do this too, and you could apply it to any type of, well, basically any kind of threat, or you could do it across the whole ecosystem. So some data, you can't have slides without pretty pictures. Basically, what you're seeing here is that at the beginning of the pandemic, or a little bit into the pandemic, there was a massive spike in registrations. That's the blue line. And then they taper off and they slowly level out. And the red line is the actual threats, or the actual names with evidence that we found, the ones that we then reported. And you can see it's a small portion of the names that were registered. And it's been going down. It's still there. It's still ticking along, but it's not at the state that it was in the first days. And of course, the little spikes are every time there's a new name or a new thing. They can be driven by all kinds of real world events. You know, if a particular government goes and does payment systems where they're sending out checks, or there's a new drug, or there's a new outbreak, a new variant, you'll see that the bad guys always try and jump on top of those. Nothing surprising there. Water. So that's where we are, 45 minutes precisely. I would happily take questions on any of these programs, or more generic questions if people wish to ask them.
Okay, thank you so much. I have 3 questions, and I think some more are coming in, but let me go back to, I just put it into the chat. The first question came from Charles Alou. He asked, how can ICANN help the innocent users to be safe online, especially those that are underprivileged members of society that in particular use only mobile devices?
So that's an interesting question. You know, ICANN can help people by doing its part, right? ICANN is not a safety organization. We do have training materials. We make them available. We have something called ICANN Learn, where people can come and learn. But this is a societal problem. The internet reflects society. The bad guys know this, that they try and leverage it, and of course they always pick on the underprivileged, the less secure, and it's a real problem. So ICANN can help by doing its bit. The programs we do, the trainings we do, working with other organizations, providing expertise is something we do a lot of. Something we don't talk about a lot, but we do a lot of is, for example, we work a lot with law enforcement, international law enforcement. That is mainly in the form of training. So helping law enforcement to understand how the identifier systems work and how the internet works. That's the kind of thing that ICANN can do. We can go out and we can lend that subject matter expertise to the people on the ground who are trying to help people.
Great. Okay. So Mohan also asks, what can a typical ISOC chapter do for containing the DNS abuse?
It's very similar. You can do, education. I'm a strong believer that education is key. I think, unfortunately, still in society, we have a lot of people that are a little too trusting, and they don't see the internet in the same light they see the physical world. So somebody who would not walk down a dark alley on their own at night, even in their own town or village, will happily go to places on the internet that they shouldn't, not realizing that things that happen online can translate into real world physical harm, even if that is only financial, and other kind of harms as well, of course.
Okay, I thought there was a question from Bill, but apparently Bill clarified that it was a comment, so he may put something else in. I see Charles typing in. There was another comment earlier, but I think you addressed it. It was from Mahood, who talked about the Facebook thing, and I was just probing him to see if he wanted to elaborate on that. And if we go back to his original comment, I know you dreaded that question.
Yeah. Well, I didn't really dread it. I just really don't like picking on individual cases. I think Mahood's question was whether or not it was considered an attack. So no, it wasn't really an attack. But if you're relying on a resource, Facebook or anything else, as the end user, it doesn't matter whether it was an attack or not from a user's perspective of trying to use it. It would matter if it was an attack where they were getting into data, etc. This it was a BGP failure. So when this happens, whenever there's a large scale attack, my telephone goes crazy, and whether it's my board members or press or members of the community asking me, is something under attack? Is something going on? Is the amount of people who send me like Slack messages or Skype messages asking if the internet's down is unbelievable. And of course, Facebook is a network, just like any other network. They made a configuration error, and it just happened to be a spectacular one. They would not be the first people to make a typing error on a router.
Right. And it won't be the last one, I'm sure.
And they won't be the last. So I'm not going to point fingers at them, because that is tempting the fates. I've made misconfigurations in the past, and I think all engineers have. This seemed to be spectacular, and because Facebook is so large, if it had been a small network, nobody would have ever known.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it's kind of interesting. They were in the news for other reasons, if you recall.
Yeah.
I think they were reporting on one of the whistleblowers. Charles has a question here, and you can see it in the chat as well. I'm not exactly sure what he means by it, but he types in here, apart from receiving and reporting abuses to registrars, isn't there any other option? I guess what he's saying is that where else can you go if you are seeing abuse? And besides reporting it to your registrars, where else can they go to get help?
So it depends what kind of abuse, right? So if it really is about the specific domain name, and you want an action to happen on that domain name, make it stop working, then that's the registrar. But that might not be what you want. The problem may actually be the content, right? So not the name itself, but the content that is being led to by that domain name. Well, that's not necessarily the registrar. That is the hosting provider, right? So if you're worried about the content, say the website itself, rather than something to the name, you also want to talk to the content provider, which is going to be the hosting provider. If it's a criminal matter, you should involve law enforcement. Now, unfortunately, many local law enforcement may not know what to do this, but you should at least get a report so that you can send that to the registrar if you need something doing there. Sometimes it's the registry. It's one of those things where it really depends, and a lot of these nuances are not always clear to the victim. Many victims don't even know what a registrar is. So that's one of the things that we have, is we have a lot of people using the internet who are not really familiar with how it works, and nor do they need to be for most cases. So that education problem of educating people of where to go, how to deal with issues, is actually rather large. And it's not ICANN's issue. It really is a societal issue.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the first cars that people had. They had to actually be amateur mechanics, and if I recall, one of the trips that Mercedes Benz did, his spouse was driving, and she actually had to repair the vehicle to get to the destination she was going. So she was quite mechanical. So yeah, there's a big education to happen here. I just noticed that Bill did another comment, and I think we're wrapping up very soon. The difference between a registrar and a registry is to particularly obscure to the general public. Absolutely true. Bill.
We do not help with some of the terminology, industry-specific terminology that we use. Because to a layman, just like any industry, the industry-specific terminology is hard to know. I mean, really, the registrar is the sales point. And the registry is the back end provider that most users and people who register names don't actually care about that much, right? They deal with the registrar, and then you bring in resellers and all these other players into the game, and it can be quite confusing.
I wanted to ask you, how can people get involved with some of these committees you mentioned as newcomers?
So something like a technical study group is not for newcomers, right? So, so some of the people on this current technical study group had never been to an ICANN meeting, weren't particularly familiar with ICANN, but were reached out to because they were very well known in the security sphere or in other spheres. But there are lots of places that you can get involved if you want to learn about the technology. You know, DNS OARC is a member organization, and you can become an individual member. It's not cheap to do so. I think it's like $500 or something. It might be less, but they do allow for students. If you're interested in following ICANN stuff, well, that's wide open. A lot of it is doable online. There's lots of committees doing things, as Glenn and Bill both know very well. There is an unending stream of various committees and things that people can get involved in, and policy groups, etc. at ICANN that you can get involved in. If you're interested in the sort of protocol side, the IETF also does most of its work online. You can also get involved. So many of these groups have the ability to participate online. Some of the committees you can apply for, but then you have to explain your expertise and why you help committee. The ESAC, for example, if you're a security specialist with special knowledge around internet security and name security, you can apply to be a member of the ESAC. So, you know, just try and get involved in ISOC, get involved in the chapters locally. You don't always have to be busy on the international global forum. Sometimes doing the work locally can be more gratifying, if you like, and often even have more effect because you're affecting people locally. So yeah, it's good if you get involved, but it's a wide area. And you know, if you have questions about somewhere particular, you can always email me, john.crain@icann.org, and I'm always happy to try and help and to mentor people get involved if they're interested.
Perfect. Great. Any final comments, John, before we conclude today?
No, just that, you know, this is a broad internet governance in general, and the thing we also call technical internet governance sometimes at ICANN is extremely broad, and there's a lot to learn. But just taking the step is good. So I'm glad you're all here and you're all trying to learn these things. Never feel sad to reach out to people, and you know, just you know, send an email to people. Never be afraid to ask questions, and enjoy the rest of your courses. And I'm so happy to have been invited, and thanks for the privilege, Glenn.